Before last summer, I had heard many rumors about the French culture with which I was so interested. For instance, the American caricature of a Frenchman is a thin, rude snob. Rudeness is a popular conception of the French in America. While I have never believed that generalizations can reflect an entire culture, it is difficult to ignore stereotypes when they are all that you have been told about a certain group of people. However, all of these prejudices were swept from my mind when I went to visit France last summer. The first city that I visited was L'Orange. It was a much quieter place than a tourist city like Paris, and it gave me some insight into genuine French culture. Everyone that I met was at least polite, if not forwardly jovial. Although I only knew a little bit of French at the time, as long as I tried, the locals were very helpful and very friendly. This setting was a complete contrast to what I had been told about France. I had a premonition that the entire country would be full of cultural elites who would want nothing at all to do with an American tourist. Instead, it had more of the atmosphere of a small-town market front. The largest city that I visited in France was the city of Nice. While it was not as booming as Paris, it was still quite crowded. The stores and the food markets were much more like those of a large city, but the people still acted towards me as they would in a small American town. Every exchange that I had with a cashier or street vendor was a pleasant one, and the people on the streets seemed even more positive and outgoing than people in large American cities. Experiencing Nice was the final bit of evidence that I needed to convince me that stereotypes about France that I had heard were misguided. While I was relieved that France was a more welcoming place than I had been led to believe, it also made me sad to see how few Americans saw France in the way that I had begun to see it. Perhaps there are some rude French people, but the same could be said about people from any other culture. It occurred to me that part of the reason that Americans have had bad experiences in France could be because they visited busy tourist hubs rather than quiet towns. And Americans may judge the locals based on their prejudices rather than their actual experiences. Although my trip to France was incredibly fun and interesting, what I learned about French culture was equally as important. I did not feel like a tourist when I was in France. I felt immersed and at home. This led me to the conclusion that those who have formed negative impressions of France either had unlucky experiences or they were simply going in with a negative attitude. In the future, my hope is that international communication develops to the point where Americans will be able to look at other countries like France in a new light and throw out their judgments which are detrimental to global coexistence.